The Forgotten of Bataan, Anton Bilek's story. He was 19 years old. The Philippine sun warmed his back. The scent of tropical flowers drifted through the open windows of the barracks at Clark Field, 60 miles north of Manila. It was the autumn of 1941, and for Anton Bilek, a farm kid from Illinois who'd traded cornfields for the Pacific, war was something that happened somewhere else. To someone else. Not here, not to him. The American soldiers at Clark Field played baseball in the heavy afternoon heat. They joked about the headlines from Europe, crumpled the newspapers, tossed them aside. Nobody truly believed the world was about to reach across the ocean and drag them into its throat. They were untouchable. They were American. And the days rolled by, golden and slow, one after another, until the morning of December 8, 1941. Anton was inside the day room, slouched in a chair, flipping through a sports magazine, half listening to the radio crackling in the background. Then the music stopped. An announcer's voice, strained, cracking at the edges, cut through the static. Clark Field was under attack. Anton looked up. He looked around. Nothing outside the windows, no sound, just the ordinary sky, blue and empty and still. He actually reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook, the kind a man carries for grocery lists and phone numbers, and began to scribble it down. Another rumor, another false alarm. The door exploded open. His sergeant stood in the frame, voice raw, face white. Move, now. This is real. Anton ran. He sprinted toward his assigned trench, gripping a World War I-era rifle in one hand and his gas mask in the other, legs churning beneath him. Then he looked up. The sky was no longer empty. A vast, dark formation of Japanese bombers stretched from horizon to horizon, their formations geometrically perfect, indifferent, beautiful in the most terrifying way imaginable. Then the bombs fell. The ground heaved. The air split open. The American fighters, freshly fueled, gleaming, lined up in neat rows on the tarmac just that morning, erupted into towers of fire so enormous they blotted out the sun. When the bombers finally banked away and disappeared into the haze, 80 Zero fighters dropped from the smoke like hunting birds, strafing anything that still moved below. In less time than it takes to eat a meal, Clark Field had been annihilated. The baseball diamonds, the barracks, the laughter, the slow golden days, all of it consumed in flame. The paradise was gone. What followed was controlled chaos, masquerading as a military withdrawal. On Christmas Eve, the order came down through the chain of command. Fall back to the Bataan Peninsula. Get into the jungle. Make a stand. Anton was among a small group of 5 volunteers who stayed behind at the burning ruins of the airfield, feeding aviation fuel into the last handful of battered P-40 fighters still capable of getting airborne. When that work was done, he was handed a set of truck keys and given an assignment that made his stomach turn to ice water. Drive a truck loaded with 3,000 gallons of aviation fuel down 100 miles of open road to Bataan. The roads were choked with civilians, families pushing carts, children crying, old men carrying everything they owned on their backs. One stray tracer around, one spark, and Anton and his truck would simply cease to exist. He gripped the steering wheel. He drove, mile after mile after mile through the chaos, through the fear, through roads that felt like they might never end. He made it. But Bataan was not salvation. Bataan was a trap with green walls. For months, the remnants of the American and Filipino forces dug into muddy trenches along the peninsula's rugged spine. Mechanics, clerks, truck drivers, men who'd never been trained as infantry, were handed rifles and pointed toward the sound of Japanese artillery. Rations were halved, then halved again, then simply stopped. The jungle, which had seemed so lush and alive, became a slow executioner. Malaria burned through the ranks like fire through dry grass. Dysentery hollowed men out from the inside. Every night soldiers craned their necks toward the dark ocean, watching the horizon, waiting for the silhouettes of American supply ships. The ships never came. On the 9th of April, 1942, the silence from command said everything words couldn't. The order filtered down, passed from officer to officer in hushed, broken voices. Destroy your weapons. It's over. General King had surrendered Bataan, the largest surrender of American military forces since the Civil War. Grown men wept. Some screamed. They smashed their rifles against rocks and tree trunks, the steel ringing out like funeral bells across the jungle. And as if the earth itself was registering the magnitude of the catastrophe, the ground suddenly began to tremble and roll beneath their feet. An earthquake, arriving at that precise moment, as though nature had decided to mark the occasion. Then the Japanese troops moved in. Tens of thousands of starving, hollow-eyed men were herded onto the road. Nobody told them where they were going. Nobody explained what came next. Anton stood in the column, dust coating his cracked lips, his uniform rotting off his body in the heat. They started walking. They didn't know it yet, but those first stumbling steps would carry them into history. The Bataan Death March, 65 miles under the open Philippine sun, on unpaved roads that turned the air into a furnace. There was no shade, no water, no pause. The rules of survival were established within the first hour. Keep your feet moving, or the guards moving alongside you would make sure they never moved again. Japanese soldiers worked the length of the column, barking commands nobody understood. Rifle butts rising and falling against the backs and skulls of men too slow to satisfy them. A man who stumbled got a beating. A man who fell to his knees and couldn't find the strength to rise got something far worse, the cold, swift finality of a bayonet. Bodies began appearing at the side of the road. Nobody stopped, nobody could. The thirst was the worst of it, worse in its way than the beatings. The columns would pass roadside wells, the water audible, sometimes visible, splashing cool and clear just yards from the marching men. The guards forbade anyone from breaking ranks. They forbade it absolutely, and they enforced that prohibition with bullets. Men who bolted for the water, men whose desperation had simply overwhelmed their survival instinct, were shot where they stood. Their bodies folded into the mud beside the very water they died trying to reach. Anton learned a brutal arithmetic: to look forward, only forward, at the back of the man ahead of him, nothing else. Not the bodies on the roadside, not the friends he recognized slumped against fence posts. Compassion was a luxury that cost lives. He sealed it away somewhere deep and kept moving. At night, the march paused. The prisoners were herded into wire enclosures, packed so tightly that lying down was impossible. The smell of dysentery and infected wounds hung in the heavy air like something physical. Men died in the darkness without a sound, and when morning came, their bodies were stepped over as the survivors were shoved back onto their feet and the march began again. Days bled into each other. Then finally, the gates of Camp O'Donnell. They thought the dying would slow down inside those fences. They were wrong. Camp O'Donnell was not a prison camp. It was a machine designed to produce corpses. There was almost no food. The water supply was a single stuttering tap for tens of thousands of men. Medicine did not exist. The barracks were open wooden structures that offered no protection from the monsoon rains. Malaria, dysentery, beriberi, the diseases moved through the population unchecked, choosing their victims indiscriminately. Every single morning, Anton watched the burial details assemble. It was a routine as fixed and grim as Revel. Men who'd been walking and talking the day before were now wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth could be found, carried out on makeshift stretchers, hundreds per day, some days. The burial crews, themselves barely alive, swinging shovels with arms like sticks, dug trenches that were never deep enough. When the rains came, they washed the thin layer of soil away, and the truth of what Camp O'Donnell was doing to these men lay exposed to the sky. Anton understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that he was going to die in this camp if he stayed. He volunteered for every work detail he could find. Anything to get beyond the wire, anything to keep the body functioning. When he heard that men were being selected for transport to Japan, loaded onto ships in Manila Bay, he stepped forward without hesitation. He had no idea what was waiting on those docks. The freighters anchored in Manila Bay bore no flags identifying their cargo, no red crosses, no markings of any kind. They were rusted, gray, unremarkable, the kind of vessels that, in peacetime, would have hauled industrial machinery or raw timber across the Pacific. Now they hauled men. The prisoners were marched up the gangplanks and directed toward open hatchways cut into the deck. Steel ladders descended into the cargo holds below, dark, airless caverns deep in the belly of each ship. Anton climbed down into the black and felt the heat hit him like a physical wall. There was no ventilation, no water, no sanitation of any kind. The men were packed, standing shoulder to shoulder, and still more were forced down the ladder until there was no room left to fall. The hatches above them slammed shut. The light disappeared. This is what history would call the hell ships. The vessels moved slowly across the South China Sea, and the steel hull absorbed the tropical sun hour after hour, day after day, until the temperature inside the hold climbed past 120 degrees. Men stripped off what little clothing they had. Their bodies ran with sweat that eventually stopped coming, because there was nothing left to sweat. Dehydration triggered something terrible in the human mind, a dissolution of reason, a crumbling of the thin architecture that separates men from animals. In the absolute darkness, Anton heard sounds he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. Men raving, weeping, fighting over canteens of urine. Some turned on the dead beside them, driven to unspeakable acts by a thirst that had burned away every other instinct. The darkness didn't hide it. If anything, the darkness made it worse. And then the submarines came. American submarines patrolling the South China Sea had no way of knowing what those unmarked ships were carrying. To them, they were Japanese supply convoys, legitimate targets. The prisoners could hear the acoustic ping of sonar reverberating through the hull, feel it in their chests. Then the concussive thunder of torpedo strikes hitting the ships sailing alongside them. Men screamed prayers into the dark, begging God that the Americans would find another target, terrified that rescue would come in the form of a torpedo through their own hull, that they would drown in this black hold sealed in like cargo. Anton's ship survived the crossing. When the hatches finally cracked open, the blinding white light of the Japanese coast poured down into the hold like something from another world. The men hauled up onto the deck were barely recognizable as the soldiers who had boarded in Manila. They were skeletal, filth-covered, blinking in the sun like creatures dragged up from some subterranean world, which, in a way, is exactly what they were about to become. Japan was cold. After months of brutal tropical heat, the mountain air hit their exposed skin like a blade. They had nothing to wear but the rags they'd been issued in the Philippines. They were loaded onto trains and carried deep into the mountains, where a coal mine waited for them like a mouth in the earth. For the next 3 years, Anton Bilek lived underground. Before sunrise every morning, he was herded with the other prisoners to the mine entrance, where cage elevators plunged hundreds of feet straight down into the rock. The tunnels at the bottom were often too narrow to stand upright. Men worked on their hands and knees in the absolute dark, swinging picks at coal seams by feel as much as sight. The air was thick with coal dust that coated the lungs and left the men coughing black. cave-ins were common. Beatings for insufficient production were a daily occurrence. And the starvation continued. Anton's body consumed itself. His weight dropped past 150, past 130, past 110, bottoming out at somewhere near 90 pounds. His uniform was blackened rags wrapped around a skeleton. He learned to hoard energy, to move with deliberate economy, to fall into a kind of sleep while standing at the mine face waiting for instructions. He stole handfuls of raw grain when the guards' attention drifted. He counted each shift not in hours, but in heartbeats. One more, one more, one more. Deep in the earth, where no light reached, something hardened in him that could not be broken. A refusal, not a plan, not a hope. Those were luxuries, but a bare animal refusal to give his captors the satisfaction. Not today, not in this pit, not like this. He kept that refusal burning through 3 winters. August 1945. The morning alarm didn't sound. Anton lay on his wooden bunk and listened to the absence of noise. The silence where the guards' shouting should have been, the stillness where the elevator cables should have been clanking, the empty space where the brutal routine of 3 years should have been filling. He sat up. Around him, other men were doing the same, exchanging looks that asked the question none of them dared say aloud. They filed out of the barracks into pale morning light. The watchtowers were empty. The gates were unattended. Weeks earlier, they'd watched formations of massive silver bombers crossing high overhead, B-29s, their contrails stitching white lines across the blue sky. They'd felt, even underground, the distant tremors of explosions that seemed different in kind from anything they'd experienced before. Something was changing. Something enormous was shifting in the world above them. Now, the camp commandant, a man who had held the power of life and death over them for years, who had exercised that power casually, regularly, with bureaucratic indifference, stood before the assembled prisoners. His head was bowed. His hands were at his sides. His voice was barely above a murmur. The Japanese Empire had surrendered. The war was finished. Anton stood in the cold mountain air and tried to understand what the words meant. His mind, rewired by years of survival calculus, stripped of everything except the pure mechanics of staying alive, didn't have a category for what it was being told. Freedom. The word felt like something from a language he'd once known and forgotten. Then the planes came back. Low and roaring American aircraft swept over the camp, but the bomb bay doors opened onto something other than destruction. Steel drums tumbling down beneath brilliantly colored parachutes, crashing into the earth around the compound, splitting open on impact to reveal crates of food, medicine, fresh clothing, peaches, condensed milk, chocolate. Anton picked up a can of peaches. He stared at it. He opened it. He put a piece of fruit in his mouth and tasted sweetness for the first time in years. He dropped to his knees in the dirt and wept. Around him, men who had survived things that should have killed them, men who had been hardened by the Death March, by the hell ships, by the black belly of the mine, were weeping openly, unashamedly, without restraint, on their knees in the Japanese mountain dirt, holding cans of peaches to their chests like something sacred. They had won, not a battle, not a campaign. They had won the only fight that had mattered since April of 1942, the fight to remain alive. The hospital ship was white as a cloud. After the long transit home, clean bunks, American voices, food served on actual plates. The ship moved through the fog of San Francisco Bay and passed beneath the red steel towers of the Golden Gate Bridge. The men crowded onto the deck, shoulders nearly touching, faces tipped upward. Nobody spoke. There were no ticker tape parades waiting for them at the docks. No brass bands, no grand ceremonies. The city moved around them like water around stones, busy and indifferent, full of people who had lived different versions of the last 3 years. The men of Bataan returned to a country that had kept moving forward without them, carrying wounds that existed in places no doctor could examine and no X-ray could see. Anton Bilek went home. He built a life. He married. He watched his children grow. He grew old in the ordinary American way, in the daylight, above ground, under open sky. But the mine was always there. The road was always there. The dark hold of the ship, the burning water at the roadside wells, the shallow graves at O'Donnell. These things do not leave a man. They take up residence somewhere behind his eyes, and they stay. What also stayed, what could not be extracted or buried or left behind on the docks of San Francisco, was the simple, staggering fact of survival. Against the mathematics that strongly favored his death, Anton Bilek had refused to become a statistic. In the mud of Bataan, in the black corridors of a Japanese coal mine, in the airless hold of a hell ship, at every point where the world told him the ledger was being closed, he had found some irreducible particle of resistance and held onto it. That particle has a name. History has tried to define it 1,000 different ways. Courage, will, stubbornness, faith. But perhaps the most honest name for it is simply this: the refusal to stop. The world is built on the backs of people who refuse to stop. In the deepest darkness, in the most absolute silence, in the moments when every rational calculation pointed toward surrender, they kept going. Not because they were certain they would survive, not because rescue was guaranteed, but because something in the human chest, something older than reason and more stubborn than fear, simply will not lie down. Anton Bilek carried that flame from Clark Field to the coal mines of Japan and all the way home under the Golden Gate. He lived. He remembered. He bore witness to what was done to him and to the men around him. And in doing so, he ensured that those men, the ones who didn't make it back, the ones left in the shallow graves of O'Donnell, in the black water of the South China Sea, in the dust of the Bataan Road, would not be entirely forgotten. They are not forgotten. They were never just soldiers. They were men.